the Academic Research Manager at EPRA. Welcome to our second research webinar series dedicated to EPRA Research Programme 2023, all the papers focusing on recent macroeconomic changes. Today, we have the second paper prepared by Bayes Business School. And we have Alexandros Skouralis, one of the author of the paper. The title is Measuring Interconnectedness and Systematic Risk in the European Listed Real Estate Sector. The webinar will be moderated by Alexandros, who is the chairman of EPRA Research Committee. If you want to read the full paper, you can just use the QR code on the screen. And also, if you have any questions, please use the chat. After the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. And I kindly remind you, if you're interested in other academic research papers, you can use the QR code to download the full paper of the first paper. And also you can visit our website to just download all the papers. I also want to kindly invite you to our third research webinar series, 26th of March, focusing on interest rate. You can register using the QR code, or directly you can use the link on our website. So thanks for your attention. And now I am giving the floor to Alex. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for funding this project and for the opportunity to present this. So this is a paper co-authored with Nicole and is about the connectedness and systemic risk in the European listed real estate sector. So every time I mention the term listed sector real estate, I'm talking about only European firms in this paper. We don't have US data. And let me take a step back and explain what this paper is about. So the paper is about systemic risk. Systemic risk is a concept that everybody has heard of, but everybody has a different definition of what it is. So systemic risk, not to be confused with systematic risk, is something different. So systematic risk is when you have the inherent market risk that you cannot diversify out. With systemic risk is more about what happens in the worst case scenario. So this concept became popular in 2008 with Lehman Brothers when we have the collapse of the institution, and this had negative effects on the US financial market, the global financial markets, and the macroeconomy. So we then said, okay, Lehman Brothers was systemically important. What about other firms? Mostly central banks are focusing on banks because they are the most systemically important institutions. So in the euro area, you have Deutsche Bank. You also have, like in the UK, you have HSBC and Barclays. These institutions are considered to be very systemically important. But what about other sectors? So the research on this aspect is not so advanced. So there are a few papers on systemic risk in the listed real estate sector, insurance companies, and this paper adds to this strand of literature. So what we'll see today is what will happen if you have an event at the firm level, at the sectoral level for listed real estate, how the financial markets react to that. So systemic risk is more about the tail dependency, the tail correlation. What will happen in the worst case scenario when we have distress in one of the markets, how the financial market reacts. The good thing about that is that we don't care only about the macroprudential reasons and purposes. We can also see the systemic exposure of this firm. So we can quantify how much a firm is exposed to risk in the system. With system, again, I mean the financial system. And this is also a difference with systematic risk when you have the stock market index. And then most importantly, systemic risk, there's things that can reduce your systemic risk, the systemic exposure, in comparison with the systematic risk. Also, we will use these measures of systemic risk to study not only the exposure to the market, but also the exposure of listed real estate companies to each other, so to other firms. So we can have an index indicator in the end of how connected the European listed real estate sector is, and how this affects like diversification opportunities, portfolio theory, how this will have an impact. So if you're in a period with very high degree of connectedness, this is bad and this is bad because when you have a negative shock, like we had the recent war, this will spread across all the firms and they will all move together. And the bad thing about systemic risk and connectedness is that they react to negative shocks, not so much to positive shocks. So if something good happens, then you can see connectedness going down because only a few firms will be affected. When something bad happens, usually all the firms move together. So we expect a negative relationship between connectedness and the returns of the index. So in this chart here, we have two indices. It's from 2004 to it's like 20-year period. And the blue line is the data stream financial market index, which includes 350 companies, mostly are investment trusts, not real estate, investment trusts, investment companies, banks, of course, and insurance companies. And then the red line is our index, the one we use for this paper. So it's an market capitalization weighted index of real estate firms. And you can see that for the entire time period we have, real estate outperforms the financial market index. So if you see the numbers, again, these are average returns. That's why it's so low. But it's around 0.04 for the real estate, the average return, and 0.02 for the financial market. The only weird period, let's say, is the end now, the period 2002, 2022, 2023. And when we have the war, when the war started, then we can see it's the only period that real estate performed poorly compared to the financial market index. So we'll talk about that in the next slide and see how connectors changed during this period. So in the next slide, I would explain more the methodology. So in 20 minutes that I have today, I won't go through all the technical part. The only thing I want to mention is that our index of systemic risk is based on value at risk. Value at risk that measures tail risk, and it's a concept that I guess most of you are familiar with. So we have this sample of 88 companies from 7 countries, entire big time period, long time period, and you can see that we have the daily returns, and if you set them from lowest to highest, as we do in this distribution chart, and look at the 5th percentile, it's the value at risk of the real estate sector, again, based on our sample time period. So this is 0.54. This 0.54 is an absolute value, and it's, if you go to the chart in the left tail of the distribution, you can see this is its value at risk. Is this the 5% worst days of the index? What we will do in this paper, we quantify the value at risk of the real estate sector when the financial market is under distress. And by under distress, we mean when the financial market is equal to its value at risk, what is the value at risk of the real estate index? And the answer to that is 0.82. So again, when the market is under distress, the financial market, the value at risk of the real estate sector is 0.82, whereas it was just 0.54 during like normal period. The difference between these two gives you the systemic exposure of the real estate sector. So what will happen? What is the additional tail risk for the real estate sector when the market is under distress? You can see here that this is not exactly the same, and this is a technical part. So delta covar, which we have here, is the difference between the conditional value at risk of the real estate sector when the market is under distress and when the market is at its normal time, like equal to its median returns. The thing we want you to keep from this part is that this 0.36 is the additional tail risk for the real estate sector when the market is under distress. And it's the systemic exposure of the real estate sector. And this here, 0.22, is the other way around, how the market reacts to real estate being under distress. And we find that the value at risk of the financial market index increases by 0.22, again in absolute values, when the real estate market is under distress. So we can see that real estate is not as systemically important as banks. There is no the need for a regulation and extra policies as we have the case with the banks, but again, has a systemic importance mostly because of the assets, and it's also very exposed to tail risks in the financial market system. So in the next slide, I will give you like a time variation, how this changes over time. So on the left corner, you have all the data we presented before. And in addition to the systemic exposure and the systemic risk for the listed real estate sector, we also do change the methodology a little bit, extend the methodology to capture the connectedness. So we try to find the conditional value at risk of each listed real estate company when the entire sector, real estate sector, is under distress, not the financial market. By doing that, what we capture is the degree of connectedness among the firms. And the red pinkish shaded area here is the degree of connectedness. So it's our indicator. And we can see there's peak values during the Great Financial Crisis, then the sovereign debt crisis. There is something around Brexit during 2016. Then you have the COVID pandemic. And finally, the very recent period with very, very high degree of connectedness after 2002 and the Russia-Ukraine war. And this can explain the blue line, which is the return of the index, as we saw this in the previous slides, is again the daily returns of this market capitalization weighted portfolio we have for real estate companies. You can see a very negative, strong association between returns of the index and connectedness. And this is something we expected to see. As I said, the connectedness and these measures are mostly affected by negative shocks. So in crisis period, you can see they go up right away, and this has negative effect on the returns of the index. But this is not all, it's not all bad. In the next slide, we have some statistics, summary statistics, and we say that not all companies are systemically exposed or systemically important. So if you have a company which has like a lot of assets and liabilities, or it's highly leveraged, as you expect, it is more exposed to financial market risk, and it's also more systemically important. Again, at this point, I want to mention that this is only a methodology that studies the tail correlation, tail dependency. We cannot infer causality by that. It's way more complicated to infer causality. You have to see all the linkages between between companies, but it's just based on market data, what we can see on the tail correlation between the market index and these companies. And the good news is that you can reduce your systemic exposure and risk. And to do that, the two things that usually are associated with lower systemic exposure is high profitability and high liquidity. Firms that they have these two, usually they're less exposed, despite the fact that they can have like a lot of assets, liquidity and profitability reduce their systemic exposure. Of course, we have in this table here that also the sector that you are involved in affects your systemic exposure. It's not the same for all the companies. So what we have, like some of the main results, is that healthcare appears to be less systemically exposed, and this is something we expected because it's not so correlated with the market. They have a constant demand. Also, you have that residential is and diversified are relatively not so exposed compared to other sectors, which is something we expected to see. And on the other hand, we can see that offices is the most systemically important sector, but all these statistics are just averages, and you cannot use this value, these numbers, only for comparison purposes. You cannot actually say that delta covar of offices is 0.3 because you cannot, value risk is not additive. So it's just to compare sectors with each other. And of course, this is sensitive to the number of firms we have in the data. With healthcare, we don't have so many firms as we have for offices, and maybe the largest companies invest in offices. So that's why it's not so clear to say that the sector is more systemically important or not. Again, this depends on our sample. And then for robustness purposes, we also do in the next slide, we also do some additional tests with connectedness. So, okay, we have our indicator of with conditional value at risk and how firms go move, but there are other methodologies in the literature. So many of them, you have principal component analysis, you have the dynamic causality index, and you also have the spillover index. All these are very popular in the literature. I will only present the last one, the spillover index here, and we do both among sectors and also among countries, among different markets. There are some findings, interesting findings. So for the great financial crisis, you have that they affect both markets and sectors, the connectors between both markets and sectors. The same is with the recent war, that you can see that they present a big value for both markets and sectors. And interestingly, we can see that the Brexit vote had an impact, especially like in both sectors, which wasn't so strong in the COVAR method. The sovereign debt crisis also had an impact. And finally, we can see that it's very interesting. I think the most interesting finding from this chart, during the COVID period, there is not so much connectedness among sectors, but there is very high connectedness among markets. So all countries were affected, not all sectors were affected. And again, there's like logistics and healthcare, maybe residential, listed real estate companies that perform better than retail and offices. So you can see that clearly that sectors present low degree of connectedness, whereas all the countries had more homogeneous impact. And in the next final slide, I will briefly talk about that. This is an exercise we did just to test if our research has actual implications. And we see that we have a portfolio of, it was like 11 market indices, a 20-year period. And this is a constraint optimization in which we have different time periods. Of course, the results are sensitive to the sectors you will choose, the time periods and everything, but it's just to indicate that if we use, instead of the mean variance theory, we use a conditional value at risk portfolio optimization, we can see that the real estate sector performs really well, especially during the COVID period, the start of the COVID period, and during the great financial crisis, but did very poorly very recently after the war, when the weight reduced drastically. So I think I'm running out of time, so I will stop here. And in the next slide, the final slide, I have my email address. So if you have more questions, please feel free to email me. If you have any suggestion, we'll be more than welcome.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Alex. And just a reminder to people, if they do have questions, we've got a few minutes left. If they do have questions, please put them in the chat. I've certainly got a few to kick off with. Very interesting. One of the things that struck me is when you showed that chart of the connectedness and systemic risk historically, it appeared, I think, that 2022, 2023 appeared to be at a higher level of systemic risk or connectedness than the global. I don't know if we can go back to that chart by chance, but it seemed to be at a higher level than it was during the global financial crisis. So what do you think the sort of the outlook is going to be? Presumably that was interest rate dependent, but what do you think the outlook is for the next sort of year or two?
Yeah, so just to point out at this stage, so it's easier to examine the degree of connectedness when the event is over. So when you have the great financial crisis, we have a lot of years after that, so we can examine the degree of connectedness and what happened there. But now that the war is still in progress, that the whole uncertainty is still in progress, we're not sure that the estimations are correct. Maybe if we have another 5 years in the future, the level of connectedness may be lower than we expect right now. What we expect, though, from the next couple of months is that because the data it's until September 2023, we don't even have the last 5 months there. But we expect that since the inflationary pressure have weakened and we have interest rate cuts and expansionary policy, this will boost the market. And we have seen from our data that real estate bounces back very quickly. So we expect that in the next couple of months, the weight on this conditional value portfolio will increase rapidly.
Okay, so there is quite a runoff in terms of those numbers, as you say. Effectively, as the shocks reverberate throughout the system, the connectedness is discovered. Exactly. Yeah. So there we go. So if we go back another couple.
Yes, the one
more.
Yeah,
this one. That's the one. Thank you for that. Yeah, so exactly. So you'd effectively expect that to come down naturally because that's when the initial shock was, or the highest level of connectedness. Got it.
It's the same when you are talking about real estate bubbles, and you cannot actually identify a bubble unless there's a bust, and the period, like have a couple of years after that, so you can examine, there was a misalignment in the market. But when you are during the event, it's very difficult to quantify the level of connectedness in this case. But we can see, like in the end, that real estate sector, the returns are started to increase again. So we expect that if we had another 6 months in the data, that's the situation will be like improved since then.
And then if we go forward a slide or two to the sector one, which I thought was really interesting. There we go, lovely, thank you. Which is really, go back one. Really interesting as well. So that that intuitively seems absolutely right, doesn't it? That the sectors which provide the greatest level of security and defensive qualities, such as healthcare, would have a lower sort of VAR. Well, I guess one of the things is leverage is clearly a key part, and you talked about liquidity in the literature, and leverage being a key factor as well. Is there anything literature, or are you thinking of in future studies looking at the impact of size? Because I guess again, intuitively, we would expect the bigger companies to have a greater level of connectedness to the financial system, and the smaller ones to have a lower one. Is that something that you would look at as well as sectors?
Yes. So of course, like in the full paper, we have some charts to show that there's a very strong correlation between total assets, total liabilities, and systemic risk and systemic exposure. And this is one of the main drivers of systemic exposure. And that's the thing about this table, and why I want to emphasize that because in different sectors have different type of companies. So again, healthcare, I don't think the biggest real estate companies will be in healthcare only. So this is a factor you have to take into consideration. This is just summary statistics. Size, of course, matters in the case of systemic risk. It's the main driver. Like with the case of the Lehman Brothers, why it was so important was the size of the operations.
Sure, exactly. And then if we go to the last slide, sorry to keep you moving around, Eleanor, but if you go to the last slide, the one after that, there we go, that one. That's a really interesting one. So just to be clear, this was portfolio optimization exercise. This was done where you had no constraints on the weightings?
Yeah, no constraints on the weighting. But we did that on purpose, and we didn't have simulated returns. We have historical returns because only then we could capture the tail dependency between the market and the firms. So I can talk about this, like, just give me a second about that. So on the second part of the table, the conditional value at risk, which is not so commonly used, is instead of having the variance as a measure of risk, we have the value at risk of this portfolio that we want to optimize when the market is under distress. So we run this in a loop, and every time we use different weights until we have the minimum value at risk conditional of the market being under distress. This is relatively new, the new ways to approach that. So we have no constraint, we have only historical returns. And this is just for us to see how this works in practice. We can, of course, improve that. Ideally, we would have firms, not only sectors. But yeah, that was just the first exercise to see the application of our work.
And again, interesting, going to that point, if you look at the healthcare sector on the far right, that appears to have the greatest weighting throughout all of those periods as well, which I guess would have implications for the healthcare sector. Okay, that's very interesting.
And this is healthcare, not healthcare real estate.
No, absolutely. That's what I was saying. So therefore, you'd expect that the healthcare real estate on that basis would be the best sector. And then I guess my next question really is just in terms of the methodology you've used here, for risk, and you've used it for the listed sector, whereas obviously there's lots of. Can you also use that for things like the direct real estate market? Can you actually look at the impact and connectivity of the direct market as well as the listed sector, or not?
That's a good point. Yeah, we can do that. So there's some work on that. So we have a paper with Nicole now, in which we try to estimate the conditional value at risk when the commercial real estate capital values are distressed again, or like lowest than expected, like one period or during period of misalignments. You can use exactly the same methodology and capture that. Again, it's just a matter of tail correlation. We cannot imply causality, but yeah, it is something applicable. We we can use that for direct real estate. We have done this with commercial real estate. It works, but we are still in the process of writing this paper, so we don't have more results at this point.
No, no problem at all. And interestingly, of course, that I think for practitioners, it's how you would apply this to look at it. And certainly one of the key things is, I know we've done some work on this, Alex, is looking at it as effectively a leading indicator. And that would affect the weighting. So therefore, you look at the change in the connectedness and the change in the systemic risk, and then you'd adjust your portfolio weightings accordingly, which I think is a very interesting topic.
It's
To discover
more sophisticated value at risk. Instead of just looking at the value at risk, you can have this as an additional indicator of tail risk in the portfolio.
Excellent and great. And we've got a great question here from Guy. He always has great questions. Who asks, could you comment on the degree to which connectedness and systemic risk are asymmetric to initial shocks?
So let me go. If you can go back to the slides with the chart with the shaded area. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, so what I meant by that is that usually what connectedness can capture is how markets react to negative events. Because positive events usually are more targeted to specific sectors or companies. Even when you have expansionary policies, this will affect the whole market. But what the connectedness usually responds to is negative shocks. Because these are the only, because think what would happen to make all the companies move the same way. In good news, usually this is not the case. Some companies will outperform, one will select for your portfolio. But in a negative event, like a crisis, like the war, like COVID, all companies will have like stronger movements. That's what this interconnectedness aims to capture.
And hopefully that answers the question there, Guy. Any more questions? I'm conscious of time here. Yes, and I think we had a question here from E. Hi there, E. Do you have any evidence at the country level? That's a very good point. And is the connectedness different at country depending upon the size of the sectors? So again, as we were expanding in terms of the size of the companies and the sector basis, do you have any evidence on the country level?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And this is something that is easier to do also because with country level, so all these systemic risk indicators are based on the financial market. The financial market is for each country separately. And this is important. So when I was talking about banks, Deutsche Bank is the most systemically important bank in Germany, but can be also for the Euro area. But for the UK, let's say you have Lloyds, which is systemically important for the UK, but not for the Euro area or the Europe in general. So what we do here, we just study the tail dependence between the country's financial market index and these stocks, just to clarify that. Then we can do a country level index, and usually is what central banks do, and they have some country level systemic stress indicators. They use different methodologies with that. They usually have different spreads, and they combine them together with principal component analysis, and they have an index for each country. But this is something we want to do as well, to produce country level indicators, maybe here Euro area, UK, like Sweden, or each country differently, and it's significantly better because you have a more diverse sample there.
I'd agree. I think that's a very interesting development to actually look at it at the country level, because then you're isolating those specific sort of negative shocks to the country.
Yeah,
some of them may be as well as across
for
the
the
board.
UK, you have more than 40 companies. It's easier to do. You have more diverse portfolio than looking only offices.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly the UK has some certainly separately identified risks compared to sort of Europe.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, sadly, that is the end of it. But Alex, thank you so much. And also, Nicole, thank you so much for that paper. It's a really interesting topic, very much in the news at the moment, and very much, hopefully, a guide to people as to how they can start to use that in terms of practical applications. A reminder that you can download the paper, as Dilek mentioned earlier on. And thank you very much indeed. And look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Thank you.